Hi, and welcome to Journey Forward with Jory Rose, where you will gain insights, tools, and inspiration to get unstuck and live your best life. Jory is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a passion for helping people cultivate awareness and authenticity so they can show up fully in all aspects of their life. And now, here's Jory.
Okay, so this is going to be one of my more technical episodes, but I will say it's actually super important in understanding almost everything else I talk about and teach. And it's all about your brain. But before I jump into that, I've told you how I used to be super anxious and would always be living in fear. Well, that fear caused me a lot of anxiety in the unknown, and I can honestly tell you, I am not like that anymore. In fact, one of the ways that used to show up in my life had to do with travel. I used to get so anxious that I would freak out as soon as I even booked a plane flight and would have a nervous stomach every time I even thought about it, even if it was months in advance. And I can honestly tell you, I don't do that anymore at all. I have literally rewired my response pattern to that fear. I've overcome this so much that I am doing things so far out of my comfort zone, travel I never would have imagined I would do. I'll share more on those experiences another time because they're amazing stories, but trust me, if I can do this, so can you. So here's the thing. The relationship between your emotional brain and your executive functioning is key, and it's something many people don't actually realize. So I'm going to explain this a lot further and hopefully in a way that will be really easy for you to be able to understand, because my brain doesn't think in too much of a scientific way. So I like to teach it in a very straightforward way that not only will you be able to understand, but integrate into your practice. Okay, a few questions for you. Have you ever been mad and said something you didn't mean? Or what about, have you ever been stressed and just couldn't think straight? Or have you been nervous and forgotten something? Or what about when you're anxious and your mind is just fuzzy? Well, congratulate yourself. You have a working brain. And when this is all happening, your brain is simply doing what your brain is designed to do. But yet, we get caught in these cycles of emotional reactivity and don't know what to do about it. And then we think something's wrong with us and that we just end up staying stuck. So I'm going to tell you a few really important things about your brain, and it'll give you this power of understanding, which will allow you to therefore know yourself better, increase awareness of your patterns, but most importantly, know what to do about it. Okay, so this really isn't in any particular order of importance, so let's get to it. Okay, so your emotional brain is located right in the center. And when your emotions fire off, you have an alarm called an amygdala, which starts blaring. When this emotional alarm starts going off from any strong emotion, you name it, frustration, anger, sadness, depression, anxiety, stress, even overtired, overhungry. So when your amygdala fires off, it's going to shut down your executive functioning. And your executive functioning resides in the front part of your brain. And this is the part of your brain that's responsible for logic, rationality, decision-making, clear thinking, language, communication, learning and retaining information. I think that's all the areas that I covered. And so when this executive functioning is shut down, we have a hard time making decisions and being rational. So, like I said, there's a relationship between the emotional part of your brain and your executive functioning, and it's reciprocal. Emotional brain fires off, executive functioning goes down. One of the ways I like to explain this, we can easily see this happening with a tantruming child. Their emotions are firing off, and their ability to be logical about what they're feeling or what they're wanting to do with what's going on just isn't there. Emotions simply aren't logical. They reside in different parts of your brain. Okay, so I think we understand that because we've all had those experiences. So next thing about the brain I want you to understand. We also in the center part of our brain have what's called our autonomic nervous system. And we have two things as part of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for our fight, flight, and freeze response. So remember, our brains have evolved from back when we were cavemen. And the reason our brains have evolved the way they have was really out of protection. So back when we were cavemen, if we would see a bear in the cave, we would have a physiological response produced in our body that was designed to protect us from the bear. It would prepare us to either run from the bear or fight the bear. So I imagine you can predict what the physiological response that we would have when this would happen. Our heart rate would increase. Our blood would flow to our external limbs, preparing us for that running or that fighting of the bear. Our pupils get larger. We start to sweat. Sometimes you may feel a tightness in your chest or a throat constriction or even a pit in your stomach. So this is the physiological response that there is a threat. Now, the other part of our autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic, and that is the rest and digest part of your brain, which also has a physiological response. That's the part of your brain that says, there's actually no threat here. I'm safe. I'm okay. I can calm down now. So that physiological response, your heart rate begins to slow back down to normal. Your blood flows back into your internal organs. You stop sweating. You stop feeling that nervous pit in your stomach. Your pupils aren't going to be so large anymore. That's the thing that lets us know we're safe and we're okay. So I'll get back to how this impacts us with our emotions in just a moment. But more different ideas about the brain you may not know about. So we have, again, as part of that evolutionary design in our brain, what's called a negativity bias. And this means that our brain has been designed to focus on the negative. So why would we want a brain that focuses on the negative? Well, for the same evolutionary purposes, it's designed to keep us safe. So back when we were cavemen, if there was a bear in the cave, or if there was 10 fish we could go catch and feed our family for dinner, what would we focus on the most? We'd focus on the bear in the cave. We don't want to be eaten. We don't want to be the bear's dinner, right? Modern day analogy to this, if you are given 1 criticism or 10 compliments, what are you going to remember the most? Likelihood is you're going to focus on the criticism. Partially because we don't have a very good practice of self-compassion, so we have a hard time actually receiving and believing the compliments. But that negativity bias in our brain is going to have us focus on the criticism as a reminder of how we don't want to feel so we can motivate to not have that happen again. Makes sense, right? In fact, one of the premier people who researches this is a great guy named Rick Hansen. He's written a couple of phenomenal books, Buddha's Brain and Hardwiring Happiness and Just One Thing. And he talks about how because of this negativity bias, that we are Velcro to the negative and we are Teflon to the positive. So he is saying we are drawn to what's negative and we let the good just slide off of us. So again, I'm sure you can relate this experience and these examples to your life and things that you have going on. So another concept of the brain, and I'm going to tie this all back together at the end, but I want to get these concepts clear. So another thing about your brain is this idea that neurons that fire together, wire together. And this is a fancy way of saying the more you focus on something, the bigger it becomes. So because we have that negativity bias, here's what it looks like. We have a negative thought. We think about that thought. We ruminate on that thought. We start believing the thought to be real because, again, the more attention you give that thought, neurons are firing off, connecting with nearby neurons, strengthening that thought into your neural code and becoming part of your implicit way of being. So the more you focus on that thought, the bigger it becomes. You start to believe it. You start to act as if it's actually real, when really, in reality, it was just a thought. Well, Rick Hansen says that we're actually able to get out of this loop of focusing on the negative reactive thoughts. It all has to start, though, with awareness. If you don't have awareness that you're focusing on the negative, it will be harder to shift out of that pattern. So where do we want to shift our mind to if we're drawn to the negative? Well, again, through awareness, we can shift that negative to the positive. Things like gratitude, compassion, self-compassion, loving kindness, being in the present moment, looking for the good, because the more you look for the good and the more you dwell in the good, those neurons are going to fire and wire together, strengthening that good into your neural code, helping you rewire that brain out of the negativity towards being happier. Hopefully this is all making sense so far. So the good news behind all of these things that I'm sharing about the brain is what neuroscience tells us is that we are able to rewire our brain. So the fancy word for that's called neuroplasticity, and I think I may have mentioned it before, and it requires experience dependence, which means we actually have to do something different in order for that brain to rewire a new response pattern. So I think I've mentioned how much I love visuals and that they are really helpful in methods for learning and retaining important information. And this visual is the one that I hear back the most from all my clients and from the attendees of my classes and meditations that they remember the most. And it comes to their mind when they're trying to practice these tools. Okay, so here it is. Imagine a snowy field. And the snow only has one path to get you across. And this pathway is so well established that the snow embankments on either side are like 10 feet high. It is clearly the only path across the snow. However, you don't like where the path takes you. Okay, so this path represents our habits or our patterns, our reactions, our defenses, things that we typically do, but we don't like how it makes us feel. But it's so well ingrained as a habit, it feels like it's the only option. So what do we do about this? Well, with awareness, we can stand at the edge of the snowy field and observe, oh, wow, look, there's that path again. But I don't like where it takes me. It's not serving me. So I'm going to intentionally create a new path. So I'm going to start walking footsteps in the other direction. And at first, that's going to be really hard because those footsteps aren't yet a path. But if I keep doing it and I keep committing and I keep having the intention to stick with it, eventually those footsteps will turn into a well-established path. And if I keep choosing that new path over and over and over again, guess what's going to happen to the other one? Yep. It will get snowed over. So that visual is literally what it looks like in your brain to rewire a new habit and a new pattern. So it all starts with awareness. Otherwise, we just continuously stay in that negative reactive loop, thinking, hoping, and wishing it will get better, thinking that we're the problem and the universe is just out to get us, which I'm here to tell you is not true. But you do have the ability to create new habits from your mind's ability to be able to get out of that reactivity and into something that's serving you. So, to recap, You've got the emotional brain that when it fires off, shuts down your executive functioning. All of that logic, reason, rationality, decision-making, clear thinking, all that goes out the window when that emotional brain takes over. Okay? And when that emotional brain takes over, because we're in that fight, flight, freeze mode, we are reacting to what's coming up. Our body thinks it's a threat. And we go into that increased heart rate, that frustration, that blood boiling. Well, here is the flaw in how our brain is designed. So remember I said we go into that fight, flight, freeze when we see a bear in the cave? Well, our body is going to have the same physiological response if we see the bear in the cave or if we see a shadow that we perceive as a bear. So what does that mean? It means that our thoughts are incredibly powerful. And our brain cannot always differentiate between thought and reality. And those thoughts are going to produce the same physiological response as reality would. And it's preparing us to go into that fight, flight, freeze reaction mode. So without awareness, we're going to get caught up in our thoughts. And that's why thoughts lead us to feeling stressed and anxious. It's not the reality often of what's happening that we feel stressed and anxious or nervous or depressed or scared or whatever it is that's coming up for you. It's that thought of what if this happens? So yeah, our brain responds to thoughts as if they are real. Well, guess how many thoughts your mind produces a day? Between 50 and 70,000 thoughts a day. Although most people, when I ask them that question, they think it's up in the millions. But I know it feels that way. So remember, your mind is a thought-producing machine. And because of that negativity bias, we're going to be Velcro to the negative and Teflon to the positive. And we're going to stay stuck in that reactive loop, reacting in that fight, flight, freeze mode to any thought that comes up, keeping us in that loop of stress and anxiousness and not knowing what to do about it. So the good news is there is something you can do about it. How do I get out of that loop? Well, 2 proven ways. One is to breathe. Now, I know I've talked about the breath before. And remember, there's that physiological response when you breathe. Your diaphragm expands, activates a nerve in your spine, travels up to your brainstem, presses down on the rest and digest part of your brain. Remember, that's the parasympathetic nervous system we're wanting to activate. That rest and digest will calm us down. So breathing will help. The other thing to do when you notice your mind is going crazy, your emotions have fired off, your logic has shut down, it seems overly simplified, but what you have to do is simply name what's arising. I know, sounds ridiculously easy, but remember, it works. So here's how you do that. You simply observe, and if no one's around, I would do it out loud. That's what I used to do, and sometimes still do, is to name what's happening. And that's to say, wow, I'm really scared right now. Wow, I'm really overwhelmed right now. Wow, I'm noticing I'm feeling really anxious. When you can name what's arising, you are observing it. You are also creating space between you and whatever's coming up. And in that space, you're creating a pause. And in that pause is your ability to walk down the new path in the snow, to choose a new response to it. Otherwise, if you don't slow down and pause and name it, you're simply in the cycle of reactivity, and it's harder to get out of. So breathing and naming what's arising. Again, totally overly simplified. But I promise you, if you can practice to name it, it will start to shift your reactions to what's coming up. And I think having this basic understanding of what's happening in your brain, emotional brain takes over logical brain, that you're going to have a negativity bias, that neurons are going to fire and wire together. So you've got to focus on the good. So the good starts to build and to grow. And the last one, that you have the ability to rewire that, knowing that that is possible, is what can allow you to continue to take those new steps in the snow over and over and over again. And like I said, I've done this. I cannot believe the things that I do now that before would have caused massive anxiety attacks. And I gave the example of travel because that's where it showed up so frequently for me, where I was terrified of it. And I was afraid of my safety. I was afraid of something bad happening. And all I wanted was to know I got back home safely. And I often would spend the entire vacation in anticipation just getting back home, not even really enjoying myself. So again, if I can do this, I promise you can do this too. So your takeaway today is try to increase awareness without judgment of when your emotional brain starts to get activated and starts to take over. Even simply saying, oh, wow, look at that. My emotional brain is starting to fire off right now. I'm really beginning to feel this strongly. Just say it in whatever makes sense to you out loud or in your own mind. Breathe through it and respond. More importantly, just name it. Walk the other footsteps in the snow. I know it sounds overly simplified, but it really does work. So hopefully you found this understanding of your brain helpful. I think it's also really helpful, especially if you have children, to explain some of these things to them. I used to teach mindfulness to very young kids, and let me tell you, kids get this concept. They understand what it feels like when their emotional brain is taking over, and that's why they lose their words. That's why they're screaming and crying. And, let me tell you, the last thing a tantruming child is going to do when you say take a deep breath and calm down is take a deep breath and calm down. They're going to have a hard time accessing it. But to name for them that their emotions are there and what they're experiencing, that naming it will help quiet it down, at least temporarily, and at least for you to not get caught up in that own reactivity. So that was one little example. I will talk a lot more about parenting and other tools. But remember, if any of this resonates with you, it means you have a working brain. You just have to know what to do with it. So I encourage you to practice naming it, remembering to breathe. And if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear in any of the reviews. And please, this is something that I find so helpful that if this resonated with you, please share this with others. Because if we can all understand where our reactivity is coming from, we have a much better ability at learning how to manage it. All right, thanks for tuning in today. Bye-bye.
To continue your journey forward, find Jory Rose on Facebook and Instagram to become part of her growing community. You can also gain access to her meditations, books, online classes, or to sign up for an upcoming retreat, visit her at joryrose.com. That's JOREEROSE.com.